Back to ARC tutorials. This is testing concept series where we are learning about all the concepts and all the terminologies that are related with testing because they are equally important for both developers as well as our QA teams. This is part 5 of the series. In today's episode we are learning about what is white box testing. So today we are in episode number 5. If you have missed out on the previous episodes in the playlist, make sure that you check them out. You will have continuity in your learning. Alright, so let's talk about what is white box testing. So white box testing is often referred to something where the focus is on the code, whereas the focus is on the internal structure, architecture, and working of the application or the system. In other words, the tester needs to have knowledge of the internal workings of the system and uses this knowledge to design and execute the test cases. That clearly, like a good example is your unit testing. You need to clearly know what is happening. So that's a white box testing. White box testing is also known as clear box testing, glass box testing, or structural testing because it focuses on the internal structure of the application. This is really critical because in right now in agile applications there is no such thing like not knowing the internal structure for QA teams especially. So they also should need to focus about how it's working, how the API calls are going to which domain, which URL, etc. So that's where you should know about the internal structure because it won't be any simple just request response model anymore. There would be multiple systems involved. There would be multiple communication happening between different various services. Even at UI level, there would be different ways of how it is architectured. So that's why you should learn and try and focus on how the architecture is there, how the internal systems are arranged. All right, so let's talk about now some of the advantages, right? Now, some of the clear advantages are it can identify issues that may not be apparent to the user's perspective. Because it is white box, you're looking at the one level below the functional testing, right? That means that your focus is on the code, at the architecture, at the workflow. A lot of times your application is poor in performance because of purely because of the way it's written at the code level. So those are the things that can really be solved when you look at the code and then write the test scripts and the test suite. The second thing is it provides insights into the internal working of the system. Now, what happens is when you can constantly review the internal systems for complexity or possible bugs or potential optimizations, your quality of the code becomes good over a period of time. Right? I have had a lot of times when our automation QA teams, when I work with them, we have come and figured out a better way of doing something, and we saw some vulnerability in the code and much more. So you get a lot of insights when you actually look at the code, and when QA automation team members they do white box testing, they look at the code, they look at the architecture and provide their feedback and inputs. It can be performed early in the development process. From sprint 1 onwards, the team can start taking a look at the code and any potential issues, or let's say you write there is a method which can be generalized, right? And if it's written 5 or 6 places, obviously the QA team will say I will not call 5 or 6 times. Instead, you make it a generic code. That's one of the classic examples that I have seen in past in my experience. So that really helps. The sooner you provide access of the code, and when QA teams are able to look at the code and come up with test suite or their own code and then provide feedback, that's really extremely important. And a lot of times white box testing can really be automated end to end, right? There are a lot of tools to analyze your code, will tell you the code quality, unit testing. This can save time, resources, because a lot of tools will analyze your code and say what are the repeated lines of code, what is the function which is repeated, what can be optimized, etc., and which data structure will not scale. You get a lot of insights through those tools, so that's really a good way, I would say, and that's where white box testing comes into play. Now, like any other process or a system, right? Even white box testing has some disadvantages, and mainly the challenges are with respect to the knowledge of the system. A lot of times, QA teams are restricted at functional level. Only a certain automation QA engineers get to take a look at the code, and that too at a very high level. So basically it requires knowledge of deep knowledge of the entire software architecture, and that's a challenge I would say. And I would encourage all the QA team and development to kind of take up that challenge, go through the code, try to learn how the internal systems work, and try to come up with the feedback of how to optimize, how to perform. Now, it may not provide real coverage of the user's perspective. So a lot of times developers, right, they always, you will hear this statement that it works in my local, right? That's because the focus is only on their respective functionality or code, because of which the big picture gets missed out, which is the entire end-to-end working of the application. So that's where a lot of defects start showing up and bugs start showing up. So really you can't really depend only on white box testing. Yes, white box testing will definitely help, but only white box testing will miss out on the big picture of the application. Now, white box testing is something that internal structure, workflows, APIs, network calls, all these things are time consuming. Significant amount of time and resources needs to be added in the team, which adds up to the cost of the project. So we need to be really have a balance that you should not be overspending on resources just to get them trained. That doesn't fit the bill and will only lead into expenses in the project. White box testing is not always effective. So yeah, like I said, the focus should be on the larger picture of the application testing rather than just how an API is called, how a workflow is being initialized, etc. So that's not a good measure of defect, or I would say the defect tracking becomes inadequately under tested because it's not really effective. It can lead to over reliance on the test results. Yes, you might be running unit tests, but still you might have an issue in your code or functionality. That is something that I've seen 100% of the time in all the applications I've worked. Your unit testing is there, but still there are a lot of defects because as a developer, unit testing or any script writing becomes limited because you can't really possibly automate all the use cases or scenarios. So there is a reliance on those, but definitely it's always a mixture of uh, different types of testings together in an application and not just reliant on the white box testing. All right, I hope it's clear to you about white box testing. What is white box testing? What are its advantages and disadvantages? And now I hope you will be well versed with that concept. Thank you so much for joining in this series. In the next episode, I'll talk about functional testing. If you like my work and tutorials, please do consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/arttutorials. Join me in the next episode. We'll learn about functional testing. Thank you so much for joining. See you in the next episode.